Transportation planning in the supply chain. Transportation planning must in general be put into the context of general supply chain planning and logistics planning. The interdependence of numerous processes and process steps has helped with the acceptance of the supply chain management concept. In an advanced planning systems or APS context, transportation planning is linked to other planning tasks in the supply chain context, namely to strategic network design, master planning, demand planning, and production scheduling. Industrial supply chain planning generally deals with decisions on how to deploy a company's assets and resources in order to source, convert, and distribute its products and services. The high complexity of the planning task is reduced by splitting the planning process into different sections according to the temporal planning impact. For example, long-term planning versus short-term planning. Such a differentiation is shown in this figure. In addition to a temporal fragmentation, segmentation according to the planning object is very common. Another important strategic issue is the make or buy decision with specific regard to logistics services. When making transportation decisions, a distinction must be made as to whether they are taken from a shipper's point of view with transportation being outsourced or from a fleet provider's or carrier's perspective. The carrier as a fleet operator makes long-term investment decisions toward vehicles and operating decisions promising the maximum return on these assets. The shipper will try to minimize total costs, transportation, inventory, information, and facility at the appropriate service level. Within the shorter planning horizons of tactical and operational transportation planning, complexity with regard to the interdependence of many different parties is largely reduced. Therefore, the integrative perspective of supply chain management falls behind and operational problems dominate the real-life planning environments. The combinations of relevant network arcs and nodes are often regarded as network processes and are referred to, depending on the perspective, as supply or distribution processes. Since these processes are usually installed for a long-term period, the planning task must be regarded as a strategic one. Different processes may be applied within the same network structure. This is best described by a simple example from the consumer goods industry. A product is distributed from a plant to many customers via a distribution center, where the product is stored. One of those customers requires special packaging. Packing may, in one process alternative, take place at the plant directly after production. In another process alternative, the product is repacked at the distribution center just before dispatching the ordered quantities to the according customer. These process alternatives are based on the same network architecture. The procedure for network process planning is characterized by a two-stage procedure. First, it must be decided which processes are generally admitted within the network. In the second stage, the products and material flows are assigned to these processes. The data required for decisions in the first stage is usually highly aggregated, product groups and time, while the data used in the second stage is often more detailed concerning the product information. Some well-established network processes are just-in-time and just-in-sequence concepts. Network process planning is of high relevance for total landed cost or factory gate pricing concepts. These have gained increasing popularity over the past few years, usually driven by integrated purchasing and logistics organizations for inbound material flows. When people think about logistics, they often imagine lorries driving down a motorway. We know that logistics has a far wider meaning, but transport is certainly one of its main and most visible components. We discussed the role of material handling in moving materials within a facility. Now we are going to look at transport, which is concerned with the movement of materials between facilities. Transport is at the heart of all logistics, moving materials between a series of suppliers and customers. As transport also takes time, we can say that it also affects time utility. Generally, we assume that it is better to move products quickly through supply chains, meaning that time utility declines with increasing transit times. Transport is so pervasive that we tend to take it for granted and not notice it, unless your car gets stuck behind a stream of lorries. But transport is a major industry. You may think that e-commerce is affecting so many areas of logistics that fewer people are working in transport. But e-commerce is really part of the information system, and when you buy goods from a website, you still need transport to deliver it. Cost of transport. Transport is usually responsible for a major part of logistics costs, but this varies widely between different products. When you download software from a website, the transport cost is very low, but if you want a load of industrial sand, the transport cost forms a major part of the price. When organizations use third-party transport companies to move goods, they pay a commercial rate or tariff. When they use their own transport fleet, they incur costs, but these should be lower than the commercial rate. The rate is often quoted in dollars per kilogram or per ton, but it depends on several factors. Features of the product, its weight, size, density, which is defined as the ratio of weight over volume. Value, ease of handling, special conditions needed, such as cold storage, liability, the chance of problems and who is responsible for the consequences, and so on. Features of the journey, such as the length, complexity, number of countries, difficulty of border crossings, and geographical barriers. Transport, such as mode of transport, transfers between modes, routes, operators, and return loads. Market conditions, value of the customer, competition among transport providers, imbalance of trade, seasonal variations in demand, and so on. The real cost of transport has fallen in recent years as increasing efficiency has more than offset rising prices. For instance, container ships are moving more than 14,000 containers, each of which can hold up to 25 tons of goods. But over shorter journeys, there is concern that rising prices of fuel, vehicles, and drivers are making transport more expensive. Relatively cheap long-distance transport allows firms to extend their supply chains over longer distances and also change their shape. For instance, it becomes possible to cover a wider area from a single facility, and an organization might replace a string of national warehouses by a single logistics center that delivers materials to any destination in Europe, for example. One problem with transport rates is that users have little influence in setting them. In principle, an organization negotiates freely with a transport company and agrees an acceptable rate. The transport industry is very competitive, and when an organization cannot negotiate a good rate, it has the option of running its own transport. The mode of transport describes the type of transport used. There are basically 5 options: road, rail, air, water, or pipeline. Each mode has different characteristics, and the best depends on the type of goods to be moved, locations, distance, value, and a whole range of other things. Sometimes there is a real choice of mode, such as moving natural gas by tanker or pipeline, or the choice of road, rail, or air between Rome and Geneva. But often there is a little real choice. If you want to move grain from Australia to India, you use shipping. If you want to move gas from Mexico to Dallas, you use a pipeline. If you run an express parcel service across the Atlantic, you use air freight. Road transport. Road is clearly the most widely used mode of transport, and it appears in virtually every supply chain. Most road transport involves lorries driving along method roads, but it can include everything from large specialized vehicles designed to carry very heavy loads through to donkeys. The main benefit of road transport is its flexibility, as it can reach almost any location. Although the maximum speed on roads is limited, the ability to give a door-to-door or customer-to-customer service avoids transport to other modes and can give shorter overall journey times. A huge variety of road vehicles can transport almost any load, but the most common are the following. Delivery vans are the small delivery vehicles which can carry a ton or two in a sealed body. Flatbed lorries are basic rigid lorries with 2 or 3 axles and a flat platform. Box-bodied lorries are like the flatbeds, except they have enclosed bodies to give more protection to their loads. Articulated lorries are more maneuverable than rigid ones, so they can be bigger, up to the legal weight limit, which is typically 40 tons. There are several variations on articulated lorries, usually with a 2 or 3 axle truck and a 2 or 3 axle trailer. Lorry and trailer combine a rigid lorry pulling a 2 axle trailer. This gives greater capacity than an articulated lorry, but maintains some of their maneuverability. Road transport is not without its problems, including rising costs of equipment and fuel, shortages of skilled drivers, regulations on driver hours, restricted access to cities and sensitive areas, limits on exhaust emissions, traffic congestions, driving empty on return trips, and so on. The result is that road transport can be relatively expensive despite intense competition from the large number of operators, so it is generally used for shorter distances. Rail transport. Railways are most commonly used for heavy and bulky loads over long journeys. Railways are almost invariably public carriers, giving a service to all other organizations rather than private carriers. This public service is often considered so important that it is run by the state or the country. The main reason for the limited number of operators stems from the huge investment needed for tracks, rolling stock, and terminals. Once the rail track is built, it has the advantages of very high capacity, low unit costs, maintain a consistent service, reasonably high speed, and causing less pollution than road transport. The low unit costs mean that it can be used for moving large volumes of relatively low-priced materials, such as coal and minerals. Then a rule of thumb says that rail transport is more common upstream in the supply chain and road transport is more common downstream. The high capacity is another factor that discourages competition, as a track built by one firm between 2 points will generally have enough capacity to meet all demand, and it is unviable for a competitor to open a parallel line. Despite these options, the main problem with rail is its inflexibility. All train services have to be timetabled in advance so that they can fit on the same tracks, and the regular services leave little opportunity for last-minute or emergency deliveries. So journeys are at fixed times and they are clearly along prescribed routes, offering a terminal-to-terminal service rather than the more flexible customer-to-customer service or roads. Of course, rail terminals have facilities to link with other modes, particularly road. As most customers are some distance from rail terminals, they have to transfer goods to road at both ends of the journey, and this inevitably increases cost and journey time. Overall, rail transport can be a very effective option for certain types of operation, and then it is worth a firm choosing a location near to a terminal, and occasionally it is worth building special facilities. Let's continue with some other types of transport. Let's continue with water transport. Both rail and road transport have the obvious limitation of only being used on land. Most supply chains use shipping to cross the oceans at some point, and over 90% of world trade is moved by sea. There are basically 3 types of water transport: inland waterways, rivers and canals, coastal shipping, moving materials from one port to another along the coast, and ocean transport to cross the major seas. Obviously, all water transport depends on geography and the access of customers and suppliers to waterways. Even when there is a potential access, water transport needs expensive port facilities, and then like rail, it is limited to terminal routes with intermodal facilities at each end. Most water transport involves large vessels traveling through the world's shipping lanes, and many types of ship have been designed to meet specific needs. We have general cargo ships are the standard design with large holds that carry any type of cargo. Bulk carriers carry large quantities of cheap bulk materials in large holds, such as grain or ores. Tankers carry any liquid, but by far the biggest movement are oil and natural gas. Container ships are specially designed to carry standard containers. Ferries are usually ro-ro vessels that carry road vehicles over relatively short distances. Barges are towed behind ocean-going tugs. Combination ships. Many ships are designed for special purposes, often combining different kinds of operations. The main drawback with water transport is its inflexibility, being limited to appropriate ports, so journeys from suppliers to customers inevitably need a change of mode, even if they are close to ports. The other problem with shipping is that it is relatively slow and needs time to consolidate loads and transfer them at ports. However, these transfers can be very efficient, and then coastal shipping can compete with road transport for even relatively short distances. Air transportation. The low unit costs mean that water transport is the standard mode for international transport, but sometimes it is too slow. For instance, if you run a factory in Argentina and a critical machine breaks down, you do not want the spare part to be put on the next scheduled ship from Japan, which will arrive in 5 weeks' time. Then the only feasible alternative is air transport. However, it is rare for the speed of delivery to be so much more important than the cost, and air freight is limited to small amounts of expensive materials such as jewelry, pharmaceuticals, flowers, and documents. Although air freight continues to grow, it only accounts for 2 or 3% of all freight movements. There are 3 main types of operation for air freight. The first uses scheduled passenger services, where major airlines use the cargo space that is not needed for baggage. The second is a cargo service where operators run cargo planes on regular schedules. These are public carriers moving goods for any customers. The third type has charter operations, where a whole aircraft is hired for a particular delivery. Airlines offer terminal-to-terminal movements, and they rely on road transport for the initial movement from supplier to airport and the final movement from airport to customer. Many facilities have grown around airports for organizing these moves, but the transfers take time, especially with increased concerns about security. It often takes longer to get through the security checks than to make the flights, and this considerably reduces the benefits of air travel. Next type of transport is pipeline. The main users of pipelines are oil and gas, together with the utilities of water and sewage, where they form the only feasible method of transport and distribution. They can also be used for some other movements such as pulverized coal in oil and clay slurries. Pipelines have the advantage of moving large quantities over long distances, working continuously without a break, with very low operating costs, reliably with very few accidents or breakdowns, largely unaffected by environmental conditions, and with small workforce. On the other hand, they have the disadvantages of being slow, typically moving at less than 10 km per hour, inflexible, only transporting between fixed points, vulnerable to attack in politically unstable areas, and only carrying certain types of fluid. In addition, there is the huge initial investment of building dedicated pipelines. How to choose a mode of transport? Sometimes the choice of transport mode seems obvious. When you wanna To move heavy items between Singapore and Brisbane, you use shipping. To move gas from Siberia to Germany, you use a pipeline. For moving vegetables from a farm to the local market, you use road transport. Sometimes the choice is not so clear, but managers still tend to go for the easiest option and put materials on lorries without much thought for the alternatives. In practice, the choice of mode depends on a variety of factors, such as availability of facilities, which determines the modes that are realistically available, nature of materials to move, their weight, volume, and so on, nature of the journey, such as the distance, physical barriers, location of suppliers and customers, value of the materials, expensive items raise inventory costs and encourage faster modes, importance, even low-value items that would hold up operations need fast, reliable transport, transit times, as operations that have to react quickly cannot wait for critical supplies using slow transport. Reliability, with consistent delivery often being more important than transit time. Cost and flexibility to negotiate rates. Reputation and stability of carriers. Security, loss and damage, and schedules and frequency of delivery. Transport costs are often a relatively small part of overall costs, so organizations that routinely use the cheapest mode may be losing out in some other ways. An early analysis found that air freight can actually save money as it moves materials through the supply chain so quickly that organizations need fewer warehouses. So the choice is not always obvious. A rule of thumb says that the cheapest modes of transport are the least flexible, so managers have to balance different factors. This table here ranks some features where 1 is the best performer and 5 is the worst. Obviously, this only gives a general guide, and there is a lot of variability. Road transport is the only mode with enough flexibility to visit every supplier and customer. So the other modes typically transfer loads to road for both ends of the journey. The obvious point is that organizations do not have to use a single mode for an entire journey. For long journeys, the best option is to break a journey into distinct stages and use the best mode for each stage. Journeys that use several modes of transport are called intermodal. Intermodal transport refers to journeys that involve more than one mode of transport. The best mode is used for each part of the journey, with transfers at appropriate points. The aim of intermodal transport is to combine the benefits of several separate modes, but avoid the disadvantages of each, perhaps combining the low cost of shipping with the flexibility of road, or getting the speed of air with the cost of road. But the problem is that each transfer between modes needs extra handling, causing delays and adding costs. You notice this effect when you transfer between a bus and train, or between a car and plane, where you always have an annoyingly long wait at the interchange. Intermodal transport only works if this transfer can be done quickly and cheaply, giving a virtually seamless journey. The best way of achieving this is to use modular or unitized loads, which means that all materials are put into standard containers and all equipment at the transfer points is designed to deal efficiently with these. In practice, this means that as much as possible is moved in containers. Before containers, ships spent about 60% of their time laid up in port for loading and unloading, and this was a slow, time-consuming manual process, with each item individually identified and loaded or unloaded from the ship. Even the most advanced ports, this was surprisingly labor-intensive. Modern container ships can turn around in a few hours, and where it is used to take 3 weeks to turn around a conventional ship, a container ship reduces this to 1 day. Over 80% of freight ships now use containers, and these move between huge container ports around the world. These are built as big as possible to get economies of scale, and they have sophisticated facilities that largely automate movements, effectively replacing labor-intensive operations by capital-intensive ones. But the high capital costs mean that container terminals are not available in all parts of the world, and general cargo ships are still common. Of course, container ports are only one link in the chain, and the containers are then moved onto trains, lorries, or other ships for the next steps in the journey. This might be to final customer or to container terminals for transfer to the next leg of the journey, or maybe to warehouses that break bulk, allowing individual packages to continue their journeys. Benefits of containers. Putting materials into standard sealed and robust containers eliminates the need to handle items individually, and the whole container moves from source to destination. This brings considerable benefits such as simplified transport and flow of goods, easier and faster handling, shorter lead times, reduced packing costs, lower insurance costs, use of less congested routes, and improved transport. Intermodal operations allow many types of operations that would otherwise be impossible. For instance, they allow land bridges, which occur when materials cross land on what is essentially a sea journey. The best known examples are in the USA when materials from Asia cross the Pacific to the west coast of America and then travel by rail to ports on the east coast, before continuing their sea journey to Europe. Two main routes are the long bridge in the north between Seattle and Baltimore, and the short bridge in the south between Long Beach and New Orleans. Another form of intermodal transport is piggyback, where a lorry, or usually just the trailer, is driven onto a train for fast movement over a long distance. You can see this in the Channel Tunnel, where cars and lorries are driven onto a train for this part of their journey. In the last section we looked at the ownership of warehouses, where firms have the choice of using privately owned, public, or a combination of the two. With transport we made the same decision. Is it better for a company to run its own transport fleet, to use a specialist, public transport company, or combination? With transport the more common terms are in-house or on-account transport compared with third-party transport. On-account transport means that an organization uses its own transport fleet to move materials and does not offer a service to other organizations. The most common form of private transport has large companies running their own fleets of lorries, but the same principles apply to running fleets of ships or planes. On-account transport has the advantages of common aims, flexibility, shared systems, greater control, closer integration of logistics, and easier communications. Transport can also be tailored to the organization's needs with the best type of vehicles, fleet size, delivery schedule, and so on. Clearly, an organization should only use in-house transport when it is cheaper than a third-party carrier. The implication is that on-account transport must be as efficient as a specialist transport company, or else it will be too expensive. Third-party carriers are specialist transport companies that offer their services to the other organizations. The advantage of this arrangement is that the organization is free to concentrate on its core activities, while the transport company uses its size, skills, and expertise to give better services and lower costs. The transport company can also give more efficient operations by, for example, reducing the number of journeys by consolidating smaller loads from different clients into larger ones, or coordinating journeys to give backhauls. Most third-party transport is provided by common carriers. These are companies like TNT and XL Logistics that move materials on one-off basis whenever asked by another organization. If you want to send a package to Australia, you would use a common carrier such as UPS Parcel Service. Another option has an organization forming a long-term relationship with a contract carrier. The contract carrier then takes over some or all of the organization's transport for an extended period. Contract carriers offer many types of service, ranging from an occasional parcel delivery through to running a large dedicated fleet for a customer. It is worth noting that when you see a lorry painted in a firm's livery, it does not necessarily mean that the firm actually owns or runs the vehicle. It is more likely to be a contract carrier that is looking after the transport in exchange for a fee. Choice of ownership. We discussed the choice between private or public warehouses, and exactly the same considerations apply to the choice between on-account or third-party transport. Then the main considerations would be the operating costs and the lowest unit costs, capital cost and the investment needed, customer service, which must reach an acceptable standard, control and the amount to be retained, flexibility and the response to changing conditions, management skills and their availability, and recruitment and training of people to work in the fleet. Again, in common with warehousing, an increasing number of organizations are choosing to reduce their fleet and form alliances with contract suppliers. A common alternative is to use a mixture of on-account transport and third-party carriers, typically using in-house transport with enough capacity for the main operations and using a third party for any additional requirements. To be viable, the cost of third-party services must fall between two limits. The lower limit comes from the operating cost of the transport company and is the cost of providing the service. The upper limit is set by the customer and is the maximum value they put on the service. In reality, this upper limit is likely to be the customer's cost of providing the service with in-house transport. When an organization decides to run some of its own transport, it can call on many other firms to provide supporting services. These firms provide the special skills and expertise that are not usually available within a single company. Some of these firms actually move materials. Let's start with the intermediaries that move materials. These are common carriers. We have already seen that these are companies that give a transport service to any customer. Contract carriers. These take over some or all of an organization's transport over an extended time. There are many arrangements for contract carriers, but they typically involve dedicated facilities set aside exclusively for one company. Intermodal carriers. Traditionally, carriers have concentrated on one type of transport, such as shipping or road haulers. With the growth of intermodal transport, many companies offer integrated services that cover different modes. Terminal services. When materials switch from one mode of transport to another or move between different operators, the transfers are done at ports, airports, terminals, container bases, or warehouses. Typically, a transport company delivers a container to a terminal, and there the terminal operator unloads it, stores it, keeps track of movements, and loads it onto outgoing transport. The terminal operator might also provide related services such as sorting goods, breaking bulk for local delivery, and concentrating goods for onward movement. In this text you might have heard of demurrage. Terminals earn money from their throughput, which they want to be as fast as possible. Any goods that are not collected as soon as they are ready take up space and get in the way of other operations. So terminal operators charge demurrage, which is a penalty for late collection and subsequent storage, to encourage companies to collect their materials promptly. Export packers. Specialist companies can pack materials before they are shipped. This service has three advantages. The first is to make sure that goods are adequately protected for the journey. The second ensures that available space is used efficiently, and the third ensures that the packages conform for international requirements and avoid sorting and repacking to meet local regulations. Postal services. These are the traditional national mail services such as UK Royal Mail, America's US Postal Service, and so on. Small parcel carriers. These are similar to postal services, but concentrate on very fast deliveries of small packages. Companies such the Federal Express, DHL, TNT, and UPS have integrated networks that deliver to almost any location in the world, offering high customer service and generally guaranteeing next-day delivery. This service, partly encouraged by e-business and just-in-time operations, is increasing by more than 15% a year. Intermediaries that help administer movements. Freight forwarders. One problem with the third-party carriers is the expense of moving smaller loads when transport increasingly works with unitized loads and standard packages. For instance, you may want to move a third of a container of goods from Germany to Japan. Your first option is to leave empty space in the container, but then you pay to move a whole container and only use a part of it. An alternative is to use a freight forwarder. These are people who collect part loads and consolidate them into full loads, traveling between the same points. So a freight forwarder will find other companies that each want to move part of a container from Germany to Japan, and it will combine the loads to fill a container. This reduces unit costs and gives faster delivery. Freight forwarders take responsibility for the movement, including all the administration, documentation, chartering space on vessels, customs clearance, and so on. Brokers. A broker acts as an intermediary between customers and carriers. Effectively, they look at the goods to be moved, see what transport is available, and then find the best routes and negotiate conditions with carriers. Agents. These are usually local people who represent a shipping company, for example. They provide a local presence and act as intermediaries between distant carriers and local customers, exchanging information, sorting out problems, and so on. Export management companies. If a company wants to sell products in international markets but lacks experience, it can use an export management company to supply the expertise. This is a local company that essentially finds customers for their clients' products and then makes arrangements for the delivery. Those companies has a continuing contract with its client that typically gives exclusive distribution rights in a specified area, and it may take ownership of the goods or sell them on commission. Many transport services really help with the routine administration. This may seem simple, but bureaucracy is often overwhelming, and in some parts of the world it can take several days to sort it out all the details needed for a lorry to pass through an international border. Outsourcing of logistics services. Transportation and storage, as mentioned, are often regarded as a non-value creating processes and therefore may be considered as waste. Therefore, many industrial corporations have attempted to shift these processes out of their core focus business areas. In fact, in the last several years, logistics has experienced an unmatched trend toward outsourcing. Some of the reasons, including the terms and conditions, coverage and trends of outsourcing of logistics in general and of transportation services in particular, will be described in this lecture. The reasons for outsourcing logistics services are manifold, and often it is a combination of different reasons that drive outsourcing decisions. In general, every outsourcing decision is a make or buy decision in favor of the buy side. In order to better understand outsourcing decisions for logistics services, the reasons for outsourcing are categorized according to their impact horizon: strategic, tactical, and operational. Strategic reasons for outsourcing include the following: concentration on core competences, lack of internal know-how, lack of willingness to invest and build up one's own assets, and higher asset utilization due to shared assets. Tactical reasons that drive an outsourcing decision are usually of mid-term impact and often include the following: lack of one's own resources, that is, over-proportional growth in past years, increasing flexibility during transition periods or for future growth, and short-term access to a better infrastructure. As for operational reasons in favor of an outsourcing decision, the following are usually mentioned: higher operational efficiency due to better resource utilization, better operational service, and lower costs of operations due to more competitive cost structures, especially for personnel with low qualification profile. In general, any logistics process may be subject to outsourcing, but it is by no means limited to logistics. However, in common practice, some processes have been subject to more intensive outsourcing than others. Transportation and warehousing, the two key logistics processes, are subject to considerable outsourcing activities. And the broad continuation of this trend has not excluded the consumer goods supply chain as shown in this figure. The depicted analysis is based on a consumer good manufacturing companies, as well as retailers. For the consumer goods industry alone, outsourcing shares for physical transportation are reported to be considerably higher. Outsourcing of the two physical processes, transportation and warehousing, not only enjoy great popularity but are also characterized by high effectiveness. With regard to logistics processes, however, it is the physical tasks that are more likely to be subject to outsourcing than the administrative ones. While transportation itself is largely outsourced, carrier management is seldom handed over to outside companies. The trend toward the outsourcing of logistics services is still very strong. However, since a large share of logistics activities is outsourced by now, growth rates for operational processes are diminishing. However, outsourcing of logistics services that exceed the boundaries of the merely physical operation is gaining significance. The status quo and the trend are distinguished with regard to outsourcing within the three levels of operational, tactical and strategic processes. Operational, transportation 85%, warehousing 50%. Trend, growing but not at high speed. Tactical, 20 to 25%. Trend, toward mode selection, inventory management, freight payment. Growth, up to 50% until 2020. And strategic, 5 to 18%. Trend, virtual warehousing, inventory ownership, and network optimization. Generally, a transportation process involves two key players, the sender and the receiver, and either may be responsible for transportation. The contracts that determine the terms and conditions for the traded goods usually contain clauses regarding responsibility for transportation. Incoterms or international commerce terms are the standardized and internationally common terms used in these transactions. They not only specify transportation cost responsibility, but also transportation risk responsibility and responsibility to cover customs and duties. After the first two parties have been introduced, the sending or usually selling party and the receiving or usually buying party, the transportation may very well be carried out by none of these parties but by a carrier, an independent transportation service provider. They are often referred to as a third-party logistics service provider, the 3PL, or just logistics service provider. The increase in outsourcing activities on a tactical and strategic levels has led to the development of an additional type of logistics service providers referred to as the fourth-party logistics service providers, in short 4PL. Due to a high number of 3PLs operating in large transportation networks, the 4PL or LLP lead logistics providers has been devised as the additional independent instance with the task of controlling the deployment of 3PL services. Freight rate analysis. While it is generally acknowledged that efficient utilization of transportation capacity is a key to effective freight management, a structural understanding of price-building mechanisms on transportation markets may result in further saving opportunities. Outsourcing the use of less than truckload services and one-way rates supports a variable transportation cost structure. In contrast to the operation of an own fleet, transportation costs only occur for actual shipments, which are charged according to freight rates that in turn depend on the contractual agreements between shippers and carriers. It can be observed that the freight rate structure partly resembles the cost structure of the fleet provider, that is the carrier. Therefore, improving transportation efficiency will constitute a means of reducing freight costs even if transportation services are outsourced. Freight costs in consumer goods industry networks. The terms freight costs and transportation costs will be used synonymously throughout this lecture. Logistic costs do account for a substantial share of total costs for the consumer goods manufacturers. Transportation in turn is responsible for approximately 2/3 of logistic costs in the consumer goods industry. A perspective of total transportation effort in the consumer goods industry is one that is seldom shared. Inbound and outbound transportation costs are considered separately, which is typical of a strict organizational division of transportation responsibilities. A common planning approach will be needed to overcome some organizational boundaries. In addition, outbound transportation is subject to further division in terms of organizational responsibility. While transportation from the plant into the distribution center is usually in the hands of a central organizational unit, often in close proximity to the production organization, distribution is a key responsibility of national sales organizations. As a result, awareness of freight costs is rather low, since transportation costs are usually only a fraction of an organizational unit's responsibility. In effect, the organization's priority to optimize their operations will focus on areas other than transportation expenses, even more so when facing conflicting objectives such as availability and inventory requirements that impose strong additional constraints. Primary costs of transportation services. One way of determining the cost of transportation is the analysis of primary costs for transportation services. In-house provision of transportation services may in many cases constitute a serious alternative to outsourcing, at least for road transportation where investment into vehicles is minor compared to other modes of transport. Therefore, a natural price limit for outsourced road transportation is constituted by the primary cost of these services that occur for the make option when considering a make or buy decision. There are a number of factors influencing a carrier's cost structure. Capital costs reflect investment and interest for the vehicle as well as for the infrastructure. The latter will in most cases be operationalized by the provider of the infrastructure and may only be subject to long-term carrier investment decisions for terminals or hubs. Depreciation on vehicles is time-dependent. Carriers, however, will often depreciate their vehicles over a lifetime distance. Yet, even this is only the case when vehicles are subject to book depreciation. More often, they are leased or rented and therefore not subject to book depreciation. In general, the investment into any assets necessary to offer transportation services must be incorporated in a costing model. Fuel and lubricant costs are usually distance dependent and are not necessarily influenced by the amount shipped. Fuel costs may be influenced by the vehicle type and do largely depend on the prices of energy and on the efficiency of energy conversion technology. Operational and maintenance costs. Operational costs include the driver of the vehicle as well as insurance costs, taxes, road pricing, tolls, and general maintenance activities such as the replacement of wear and tear parts. Although some costs are time dependent, the driver, as time is often considered a function of distance, may be regarded indirectly as distance dependent. Other costs are directly distance dependent, maintenance, road pricing, while again others largely depend on the choice of route. Road choice is an important operational decision for transportation, usually balancing between transportation time and distance aimed at the minimization of total journey costs. This segmentation examines costs and prices of input factors when providing transportation services. Here is a different segmentation of transportation primary costs aimed at the underlying cost drivers. Vehicle-related costs. These are costs that are incurred by purchasing or leasing the fleet of vehicles. They are fixed for short-term decisions but variable for medium to long-term decisions. Fixed operating costs. These are costs that are incurred by the operation of facilities such as hubs or terminals. As for the vehicle-related costs, they are fixed for short-term decision-making and are variable in medium and long-term decision processes. Trip-related costs. These are costs that include the price of labor, fuel for each trip. These costs are independent of the quantity shipped but depend on the length and the duration of a trip. Quantity-related costs. These are costs that contain loading and unloading as well as the portion of the fuel costs that is actually dependent on the transportation quantity. Overhead costs. These are costs necessary to plan and schedule a transportation network, including those incurred from necessary investment such as IT. The concepts described in academic literature mostly cover primary costs for transportation services. However, they lack relative quantification of their cost contribution. The figure here shows that fuel and driver and vehicle costs contribute approximately 3/4 of total transportation costs. Transportation efficiency. The importance of transportation costs in consumer goods transportation networks has been stressed repeatedly in the previous lectures. An efficient provision of transportation services is therefore necessary for a sustainable business model of all actors along the consumer goods supply chain. Transportation efficiency is thus determined with the objective of supplying transportation services at minimum costs. Transportation efficiency has been subject to extensive research in the past, and while most approaches to transportation planning aim at increasing the efficiency by minimizing costs in different ways, the theoretical foundation is often lacking a quantitative statistical background. In general, there are two ways of increasing transportation efficiency for a given service. First, decreasing the factor input for a fixed amount of goods on a given transport relation. And second, increasing the number of goods that can be transported with the same factor input on a transport relation. This figure here shows that 35% of the time assets are used for loading or unloading operations, while the time on the road accounts for only 28% of the total time. Improving warehouse operations will increase asset utilization. Utilization is slightly increased to 43% when focusing on the driver. It is obvious that major delays result from loading and unloading operations. Unplanned delays lead to major deviations from the transportation schedule, with 98% of journeys recorded to have unscheduled delays. These are often incorporated into planning processes using Slack. As a result, fleets are too large and scheduled idle time is added on top of unscheduled delays.